Hello, this is Dr. Hickman. I wanted to put together a little recording for you guys to explain how to unpack the standards. It can be a little difficult even for veteran teachers. So I wanted to give you guys, just put my voice to it to maybe explain it in a little bit more detail that might help you out than just reading it in the book and on D2L. Unpacking the standards can be very difficult even for veteran teachers. But really, in its most simplest terms, what it is breaking down the standards into parts so that you can begin the process of completing stage one, which is identifying your desired results in the UBD framework. Wiggins and McTighe developed this framework of UBD to break down the three stages of lesson and unit planning. Here's stage one, where you identify your desired results. Stage two is where you develop your evidence. So these will be your assessments. We'll talk more about that later. Stage three will be your lesson plan or unit plan and how you execute your desired results, and then your assessments and how you're going to do all that. We'll talk about that later. There's really no need for us to focus on that right now. We're going to focus on this. This is explained in D2L under the example. There's a slight difference here as it relates to this word evaluate is written down as explain, but I'm keeping it here as evaluate because I do a couple different things with it that help explain what this looks like. But the topic is the same. It's still the U.S. Civil War. That's the topic. So now we'll dive into this to see how we do this. So we're only going to deal with the state standard. We're not going to deal with the Common Core. So follow along with me. I got 15 minutes. I didn't realize that when I first recorded this. So I'm doing it a second time. So if I move faster, that's why that is. So the first standard, evaluate the role groups and not individuals from the United States played in the social, political, cultural, and economic development of the world. We're focusing on big ideas, understandings, and essential questions. So the first thing you want to do is identify your nouns, because that's what you're asking students to understand and ask questions about. So as we go through this, what are the nouns that we see here? Well, we see groups, we see individuals, we see U.S., United States. We see here the social, political, cultural, and economic development. And then we also see the world. So we see all of those. Those are the nouns that we will be asking about or asking students to understand as we develop meaning. Now, usually with this, you would also go ahead and connect and create your assessment pieces, and then also your rubric from this as well. If we were to find adjectives in here, then that's where we would develop our rubric in terms of how we're going to evaluate what it is that students do, how we're going to assess that. To create our assessment, we're looking for the verbs here. So this would be evaluate. So as we created assessment, we're going to create an assessment to determine the level of evaluation, the skill that students are able to have about that. Could be writing a paper, could be giving a speech, so on and so forth. So let's move on from that. Now let's tackle big ideas, understanding, and essential questions. Again, remember, we're going to do this a little deeper, but I wanted to give you guys some of this. So we already identified our nouns, groups, individuals, United States, social, political, cultural, economic development. So from there, we want to talk about what it is that we're asking students to understand about those topics. So when you talk about understanding, you're talking about things that students can explain, interpretations we want them to try to make, how can they apply the information someplace else, how they can utilize perspective, possibly show empathy, or explore self-knowledge. Those are all examples of understanding. Those are the 6 facets of understanding, and we'll talk about that later on. So as we delve into this, students will understand that we want these things to be broad. We want them to be timeless, things that are universal as it's related to your content area. And they also can be applicable to other content areas. So for the first one, students will understand the expansion into the West fueled economic, social, and political division in the country. So, I mean, this really goes right back up to here as we're talking about economic development of the United States. And then we're also talking about political divisions in the country and social divisions in the country, and which we could probably add cultural divisions as well. So that understanding deals with all of that, and we're talking about the role that those groups, individuals, whoever was moving into the West, those individuals, and how it is that created division within the country. So if we move on to number 2, the debate over slavery was more than just to be or not to be. To quote Shakespeare, it was more than just a moral debate. So again, we're identifying groups here. We're talking about enslaved Africans, plantation owners, abolitionists, etc. And so how that debate was more than just whether or not we should have it, whether it, or not have it. And so it was an economic, political debate, but then there was also a moral debate of it as well. I'm not going to read over the rest of these. You guys can read over the rest of them, and you can see how these nouns play out in each of them. So here we are: slavery, nation's economy. Slavery being at the centerpiece of the nation's economy. I did want to point this one out here because this is talking about a specific group. This is talking about the role of women in the abolitionist movement. Now, I want to stop here and make a point, because if this was me as the teacher, this is an important point to understand. But I would also want to add something that include an understanding that included or talked about the role that African Americans played in obtaining their own emancipation. It's good to focus on women, but for me, it's also important that my students would understand how and why African Americans participated both in what they did before and during the Civil War to become free. For me, it would be important to show that African Americans were active participants and had agency as it related to their own status simply as human beings in this country. So I would do that. What's important to understand here, my content knowledge would enable me to do that. If you don't have that content knowledge, then you might not be able to do that. And pardon me, there's Disney on Ice up there. Uh-oh, and that was my daughter, so let's not do that. So anyway, again, 15 minutes, I'm not starting over. So that would be important for me to know, so I would include that. But if you don't know it, you can't include it. So folks, that's why your content knowledge has to be on point. You got to know. Sometimes what you don't teach is just as powerful as what you do teach. That's critical. We'll talk more about that later. That's called the null curriculum. So now let's go to the essential questions. So here we are, essential questions. So these are questions, ladies and gentlemen, if I can get that right. Essential questions. These are questions that you're going to want to be thought-provoking. They should not have simple answers, but they should be big picture questions. For that, they need to connect back to these big ideas and understanding. So you guys should be able to see links to each of these things. To the big understandings, the essential questions should be linked up. But you're also going to want to build upon prior knowledge that your students should have. You also want to deal with concepts, themes, and theories. My math folks out there, you should be thinking about, in particular, different mathematical concepts and theories that your students need to understand, so that can go beyond just algebra, things that they'll need to know in algebra, geometry, and calculus. Also, your essential questions should be applicable to other content areas when possible. So let's start here with this first one, because you'll see exactly that in this first essential question. How can the story of another American, past or present, influence your life? Easy peasy when you're talking about how this could be in U.S. history. Talking about the past, you're talking about history, her story, however you want to frame it. So that's easy. But how can you use this in other content areas? Well, think about it. This question is about perspective. It's about empathy. It's about self-knowledge. Easy in an English class. Any novel, poem, short story, you could probably deal with that quickly and easily. But what about a PE class? What I think about is maybe find a person who has a story of motivation, and now how your students can talk about how that story of somebody getting good with their health motivated them. Or in an art class, I know I got some art teachers out there, we could talk about how this particular story is an inspiration for particular artwork. So let's move on. Number 2 here, we're talking about economic differences. This is teaching the skill of compare and contrast. This is something that can go beyond just a U.S. history class into a world history class, but the skill of comparing and contrasting can also go to other content areas as well. Number 3 and number 4 are talking about perspective, which is again part of the idea of big understanding. So with number 3, why did Southern states secede from the Union? Well, was it because they needed slavery or because it was states' rights? Historians still argue about that. Number 4, why did Lincoln establish the Emancipation Proclamation? Did he do it to win the war, or did he do it because he saw slavery as being immoral? You could argue either one of the two of those. If it was me, I would ask a question regarding freedom and liberation, such as, what does freedom mean for oppressed people? That's a question that would connect to the big idea that I added, but it would also be applicable to other topics, time periods, and content areas. That's it for me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm getting this in under 15 minutes because I'm not going to do it again. If you have any questions, please email me. If we don't get it right through the email, then you can come back and we can set up a time for you to call me and we can have a conversation right then and there. Take your time with it. Identify those nouns. Once you identify those nouns, think big picture, ladies and gentlemen. Those big ideas, those understandings, what are you asking them to apply? What are you asking them to be able to do? Interpret, perspective, empathy, self-knowledge. When it comes down to those essential questions, think broad, think thematic. And Disney on Ice is popping up again. Think conceptual as it relates to those. Think about prior knowledge. In this piece, we're asking for it looks like we're asking for folks to have known about some parts of U.S. history, expansion of the West. We're talking about they should have known about the Louisiana Purchase. Why did states secede from the Union? We're asking that they have known things about American economics prior to the Civil War. So those are the things that your central questions and your big understanding should focus on. Again, questions, email, or we can call. I'm going to call it a night on this one, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this was very helpful to you.